Hi, I'm William. This is Basics for Blender episode 6, and I think last week well no, not last week, Tuesday, we were kind of getting a little bit away from basics, so I was thinking today we deal properly with some basics and actually look at rendering in Blender. And I was wanting to show you my Lord of the Rings scene, but my computer has been absolutely ridiculous and is currently still rendering a frame. So yeah, I will show you in a simple scene. Basically, Eevee cycles, different settings in there, why you would want to use different things for different settings and stuff like that, and how you can achieve certain effects with that. So, just give me a second, I'll just open up my chatty chat thing so I can see you while I'm in Blender. So, what I've got is just my scene with the one sculpture, just so we have something other than the basic cube, but I mean, it would work with that. And we're just going to look through like all the different things like Eevee cycles, and I'm even going to talk a little bit about some other things why you would want to use maybe some external renders or something. But before we go on, I have a question for you. Next week, what would you like me to move on to? Because the Lord of the Rings scene is gone beyond what basics I think would be, and I think I got a little bit carried away. Retopology. That's a good thing to look at. I have actually added to the stream a little suggestion thing. So if you want to suggest something for a new stream, or something to render or model, there's a stream suggestion thing. If you go to the store, or if you type in redeem suggest, it'll send you the link to go to this, and you can just redeem item and say retopology, and then I'll have that in a list so I don't forget these things. Actually asked twice because one of them shows up in chat and one of them
retopology
like that. And thanks, yeah. The model was a lot of work. I'm on fiber, but shitty fiber, South African fiber, so I can only stream at 720, unfortunately. If I go to 1080, it dies out. So, what we're looking at is how things look in Eevee. So, when you open up Blender, you'll probably be in the standard viewport shading mode, and there is the viewport rendering mode where you can see the preview for what the actual render would look like. Yeah, South African internet is not great. And not great for the price you pay for it. So Eevee, I think I've spoken this in previous things, is the simple but fast renderer in Blender, and it uses game engine technology, which means you can do it like real time almost stuff, but you're not going to get some of the detailed stuff. So if I actually switch in here from Eevee to Cycles, you'll see that it's a lot more detail and like cool lighting and stuff that appears in there, but it's also noisy and it sort of takes a moment to sort of calculate stuff. E-Cycles, is that like a external cycles thing? Huh. Actually I had note of that. Let me just... look at that properly a little bit later. That's cool. I like these things. Yeah, I also use LuxCore, but I'll just sort of barely touch on that a little bit later on, but it's actually no longer slow, which I like. And this is... LuxCore is like, if you want photorealism, do it. It's also another free thing. So that's kind of like 3 different levels of things you get, like Eevee for quick, fast, and fine renders with limitations. Cycles, you can do absolutely everything Blender can do. And then you can get external renderers that do awesome stuff. I'm definitely going to take a look at that. And a lot of that stuff has actually been changing for 2.9. So I'm currently in 2.83 now because that's just stable. But I do love that. Okay, so I think default things we should just be looking at is in Eevee, you'll see your shadows. You won't get much detail in there. So if you're aiming for a scene where you're looking for something involving, you know, perfect looking shadows and stuff, Eevee is, you can tweak things, you can like increase the detail by going down to the shadow settings. So this is all under the render properties tab. And you can do stuff like increase the shadow cube and mess with the details in your lights. So you can maybe say mess with the bias, which is basically like a fake point above the surface where it creates a shadow. And you can also add things like contact shadows, which you'll see if I zoom in to an area where we're close to an object, it tries to add in some better details in these close-up points. But it's still like faked effects. If I go now and switch into cycles, this is what actual lighting would look like, but as you see, it's way slower. So this is what you trade for. Like Eevee, you can render out a frame in less than 10 seconds. Cycles, 10 seconds is optimistic for the shortest possible time you could ever get. Unless you've got a crazy computer, you'll be going for like maybe 1 minute to 10 minutes or more. And you'll notice that in the cycles view, you get things like bounced light, and that's causing my computer to freeze out a bit. That's not like me rendering and streaming at the same time. Let's just switch back to Eevee. So you see the shadows and stuff in Eevee, you don't get that cool bounce light effect, you just get these one tone thing. Oh yeah, don't have song requests on because yeah, I don't have anything like that set up yet. Trying to use free sounds and stuff, royalty free stuff, because there's a lot of issues with that. So one thing that you can do in Eevee to just add that faked effect for bounce sliding is to actually add ambient occlusion. So ambient occlusion is the thing that you get in like game engines and stuff, which basically is just sort of fills in darkness in areas in a sort of a fake effect of where you can sort of see like objects would be closer to each other or hidden by each other, so occlusion is hidden stuff. So it's just basically everything in the sky can this point see lights, and the less it can see the sky, the darker it would be. So you can adjust things in here to get a little bit of that nice little darkness in there. It's not bounce light, but it's just a little bit of darkness in there. And you can see it's all like, this is what the final render would look like. That's the nice thing about Eevee. You can just run around and move your camera around, and everything is as it would look in your final animation or whatever. Cycles, however, as you see, it slows down my computer, so I'm not going to mess around with that too much right now. The big thing where you'll see the difference in things here is when you're looking at sampling over here. So just above the ambient occlusion, you get render and viewport sampling. So sampling is every pixel in the image it's going to look at and calculate things 16 times for a viewport and 64 times for a render, so you just get a little bit more quality. But it doesn't actually make a huge difference in Eevee with the settings that we've got on at the moment. You see, like, I can put it up to 600, and if we just let it sit for a little moment, it looks no different between that and okay, one, you'll see that you get little shadows start to look different because I'm calculating the blurred shadows, but the overall quality remains fairly similar. It's just the things that, like the shadows, that start to get a little bit smoother and stuff. Whereas in Cycles, if I switch this down to, let's just go 1, you get a whole lot of horrible noise and stuff. So in Cycles, you would have to actually add more samples to remove the noise. There are things you can do like denoising, and if you use the 2.9 branch of Blender, there's a whole lot of new settings there for optics denoising and stuff. So we're not going to go into that now, but you can sort of get away with it, but it'll sort of fake some of the sliding stuff. So you'll see that, yeah, this is not great. Yeah, I just have a shitty computer. And also I'm doing, so with the streaming, it also streams, encodes on the graphics card, so kind of messes up when I'm doing the streaming, because it kind of like gets overloaded, which kind of sucks. But yeah, I'll explain that setting. I was going to just a little bit later. So that's why I'm just leaving it on the CPU, because my GPU gets a little bit overtaxed when I'm streaming. So samples are not something you really need to worry about too much in Eevee. Anywhere between 16 and 64 will look absolutely fine. Cycles, you might have to go anywhere up to like 200, 500, depending on the complexity of the scene. So all these settings here in Eevee are very different from the ones in Cycles, because as I said, they're sort of like game engine stuff. So you get stuff like bloom and screen space reflections and things. So these are all stuff you get in like a game engine. So bloom is for bright areas and have them sort of make a hay glow. So let me just go onto some highlight areas over here. If I tweak some of these things, there's up the intensity. So just need to get it so we get a nice little highlight. This material is not great for that. Let's put this as something very shiny so we can get some nice defined points over here. So if you want to get this, you know, glowy, shiny point of stuff on your model, this is where you would get bloom from. So radius is how blurred it is, and a knee is sort of a blend between the glossy bits and the non-glossy bits. So it's a really subtle thing actually, depending on your scene. And threshold is what level of light will actually start doing this bloom. So usually you just want it to be the bright areas of the scene. And intensity, of course, is how strong this effect is. And you can have fake colored blooms and stuff like that. It's a feature that many people are annoyed by in games and stuff, but for renders, I mean, it's a very artistic thing to add. Okay, so I'm just basically going down through the list to explain what all these different things would be. View. Depth of field, you need to have it enabled on your camera. So if I select my camera, there's a depth of field setting in there. So if I turn on depth of field here, you can start to see the effects. And you get options. You can say focus on a specific object. So I can use the eyedropper or the drop down and select an object. And then as you move the camera around, it will always try to stay in focus on that. So let me bump up the effects. So f-stop, if you know anything about actual physical cameras, is the size with the iris of the lens of the camera, and usually how it'll be is the lower the number, you'll get more depth of field, and if you have a high number, you'll have less depth of field, but basically it's the size. If it's bigger, you get more light. If you get smaller thing, you get more sort of diffraction and stuff to get this nice effect. So if I move the camera around now, it will stay in focus on the center point of that object, which in this case is actually the pivot. It's like kind of at the base there. So if I move the camera around, it's always going to stay in focus at that point. So you can use this to actually add an object to your scene. So if I go say let's add a empty object, which just doesn't render anything, but you can use it to do stuff. So I'm just doing empty circle. And then if I select that as the focus object in my camera, switch to the with numpad 0, then I'll move around the camera. It's always going to keep that point in focus, and then you can animate this separately. We're going to go into animation in a later date, so you can drag this around to focus on a specific point or so in your scene, which can be a lot easier to animate than going into your camera and instead of using focus on object, going there and adjusting the exact specific focus distance. Because for this thing you'd have to go and really fine-tune to focus on a specific bit, and then as soon as you move the camera, your focus will go off or something like that. So that's always nice to use an empty and then control your focus by moving around these. So you'll see that the depth of field in Eevee is kind of weird looking. You get like, because this is just doing a simple depth blur. So game engines work with a thing called a Z buffer, which is basically an image of the scene where each pixel is the depth of that point. And so this depth of field effect just takes that image and then sort of blurs the bits that fit into a certain depth, which can look absolutely fine, but then you get bits like this top of the head here where there is actually something behind there, but it's getting blurred in between the background and stuff because there's such a heavy blur that you kind of don't get this accurate effect going on here. Depends on the realism you're going for. So it can be absolutely fine, or it can be not great. So if I switch now to cycles, you'll see the depth of field. We've got the same area in focus and stuff, but we've got a smooth, blurred out area behind it. So it's not like this hole in the background from the head in the depth of field. It's just the difference is that it's not being faked, it's actually calculating rays from the camera into the scene and not just blurring an image. So let's now go back to Eevee. You can see this basically just happens all the time. It instantly renders these things if you've got a decent enough computer. And you can just control in the main settings, the max size is just the overall max intensity of the blur that you can have on here in the screen pixels. So you can limit your depth of field like that. So I'm just going to turn off depth of field for now in the camera. So there's less distractions. And then something which I always like messing around with is subsurface scattering. So this is the thing that has to be enabled in your materials, and it's basically simulates light passing into an object and then scattering inside the object. So not just bouncing off the surface, but actually going into something. So it's the same as like looking at your hand through a bright light. So if I take a bright light and shine it onto my hand, let me just, so like a torch effect of like shining something through your hand, and you get like the blood color passing through your fingers or so. It's that effect. Whereas in Eevee it's going to be a faked effect. In Cycles it's super slow, but it's like accurate volumetric sort of effect. If you want to enable that, you have to go to your material. If you use the default Principled V SDF shader, you'll have a subsurface strength default value over here, and if I go and just pump that up to 1, you can see the default thing is using a setting for basically what skin would look like. So you're getting that reddish tint in the areas that are just outside the lit area going into the dark area. But you can see it's a sort of a faked effect because as you zoom in, you get these sort of blurred out and funny sort of fuzzy regions and stuff that's like all sharp delineations between where it's like faking a bit and stuff, and when I move around you see the axe is actually affecting how the arm, which is actually way further ahead of it, looks like. So you might want to just have a very subtle effect in Eevee, or just deal with it looking a little bit weird. Whereas if we now go to Cycles, you'll see just how much slower things are to sample in Cycles now that we're doing Subsurface. Super slow. This is sample 4 or 5 because I've just set mine to be very low. It looks way nicer, but you're going to have to add more samples to your render to actually get more detail in here. But in this case it will be actual, more realistic subsurface scattering. So there are lots of materials that use subsurface scattering in reality, like, well, heavy effects of subsurface scattering. It's not just skin, like soap, materials like marble, which, you know, you wouldn't think so, it's a stone, but it actually is porous to light to a certain degree. If you've got like murky water, so like pond water or something, that would use subsurface scattering. Imagine anything that's somewhat transparent and has, you know, particulates of some sort in it would work with that. So like milk, anything like that. What you sourcing now? What did the president have to say? So I'm just going to turn off Subsurf and then move on to the next thing. Oh yeah, so in the Subsurface, it's just, you can add more samples, and then Jitter is just a thing to, let me just actually switch back to that. They're basically just sort of a random sampling sort of thing. So you'll see that if I looking at bits, you just get a sort of bit of noise that gets added to it, so that sort of helps fix up these weird little banding issues and stuff you're getting at. And more samples will attempt to make things look a bit more realistic at the cost of things going a little bit slower. Okay, so this next thing is something that I find very limiting in Eevee versus Cycles. No schools, jeez. COVID corruption. Fun. So, screen space reflection is like the blurs that I was talking about for the depth of field, is a faked effect, and it's only works with what's visible in the screen. So if I turn on, let's go for, yeah, well, we've got a non-rough surface over here. Let's actually put, so I've made the base over here on the ground to be also this reflective surface, and we also make it metallic because that will just help you see the reflections a bit better. You see, as I move the screen around, only the bits that are visible will be reflected. So if I move down here, as the head becomes moved off the render plane, the reflection disappears. So that can be very annoying if you want to get something that looks, you know, realistic reflection. So you might have like a ceiling above you, screen space reflections, you won't get it reflected in there. So that is one of the big limitations with Eevee, but there is a thing that you can do to alleviate that. There are light probes, so you get reflection planes and reflection cube maps. So a reflection plane, if I add that, let's put this just into a little segment of the plane over here. So I'm just going to sort of match this up to the floor over here. You'll see where this sort of intersects with the plane at the floor now. If I show you this edge over here, it basically will create proper reflections, but it does this sort of by faking it by rendering another viewpoint from this flat plane. But that'll only work on a flat surface. If I go and add a sphere over here and just put that shiny material on it. I'm also going to scale this. So just increasing the distance that this has an effect. So you see if I increase the distance, it's expanding the area that this affects. Just so we can see it more on this sphere over here. You'll see that the reflection do not look accurate on this because it's designed for looking at on a flat surface. So if I look at this, it just looks absolutely wonky. So that's only really designed to work on something like this, a flat shiny floor or a wall or a mirror or something like that. So that's where you would, if you wanted to use something like a sphere, you would want to use, you would want to use a reflection cube map. So a cube map is basically, you know, a cube has 6 sides, so it basically creates a cube rendering 6 sides, top, down, left, right, bottom, and all that sort of stuff from that one point. So you can combine that together to make a sort of faked reflection around an area. So if I put this now to be there where that sphere is, then just make it a bit bigger. You'll see nothing actually has to happen. That's because for these cube maps, they don't just work with this one camera like this. You have to go into your render settings to, I think it's your indirect lighting and big cube maps. That's because these don't just do reflections, they do lighting as well. So when I click on the big cube maps, you'll see that it creates this reflection thing and it looks fairly accurate from that point. But it only looks good from in that specific region. If I look down now, you'll see that it's intersecting with the floor and it's replacing the shiny plane or reflection probe thing, and now that looks weird over there. So there are settings that you can adjust. So if I go into here, choose based on let me just see. Yeah, I think it actually is just that you have to, it doesn't actually give you a priority setting. I thought it did. Might have been looking at an older or newer version. So you have to be careful that the regions that you don't want to have funny reflections in aren't included in the cube map. So you would have to either adjust the radius of these cube maps so that they don't intersect with each other. And let me bake it. And the thing is, these things are not dynamic as well, so you have to bake them, and things won't be changing when you've got animations and stuff in there. So it gets to become a lot of work to get these things working. You have to like manually place these things on things that you want to get reflections looking nice and all that. Whereas if I delete these and go into cycles, these reflections will always be perfect no matter what, because they are traced, ray tracing basically. It's path tracing actually, but that's basically ray tracing. So they'll go from each point in the camera's view and go as far as your settings allow them to. So you'll be able to see anything reflected in something. You'd see something reflected in something, if your sampling settings are correct. We're going to go into that a little bit later. We're currently mainly going over Eevee. We'll go into cycles a little bit later. I'm just comparing the two when it's most apparent. Don't forget to vote for what you want to see on next week's stuff. I'm very curious what you want to model and stuff. I've had some cool ideas. A shuttle from the Enterprise D, a Jafar soldier helmet, those the cool Anubis head things or whatever that pop up on characters in Stargate. I really want to focus on something that's more basic that you guys can follow along with and do stuff with. So do your redeem, suggest this. So in chat, if you do this, we'll give you a link and you can go there, and because you need to actually add your description in there, so you can't do that through a chat thing for some reason. So if you follow, you can also see all the other redeemables for the chat stream as well. So screen space reflections can be fine, but anything off view won't be rendered. Like, see how the ball, the sphere over here, only the front of it is visible to the camera, so only the front of it gets reflected in the statue. So the back of it just disappears, which looks very weird. But if you have a blurry surface, let's actually change the roughness up. So not a perfect mirror. It might be fine. It might not be a problem, because this doesn't look much different than it would look with proper reflections. So it all depends on your needs. So a simple rough surface or semi-rough surface like this will work fine in Eevee without any weird setup. But if you want to do mirrors, you'll have to mess around with those cubes and stuff that I was talking about. Okay, let's go on to the next thing. So I'm just going to turn that off, and I'll just turn off all of these. The next thing is motion blur. Now this is by default in Eevee. Motion blur, I'm just going to quickly do a little animation here. We'll go into more detail on this later. So I'm just going to select this sphere. I'm going to put it in one point. I'm going to hover over the location in the transform, so that's under the N panel over here. If I press the I key over those, it'll add a keyframe. And then in the timeline at the bottom, I'm just going to go over like 10 frames. And I'm going to move the sphere across and press the I key to add another keyframe to the current location. So then in the timeline, when I drag across, this is moving. However, I've turned on motion blur, but this does nothing because the motion blur in Eevee by default only works with the motion of the camera. So if I do the same thing and add keyframes, let's just do something like this to the camera itself. Now you'll see that there is motion blur over here. So if I turn motion blur on and off, this just simulates, the effect of things blurring when you move. Motion blur. So you can add more samples if you're getting weird looking grainy blurs. And shutter is basically controlling the strength of this motion blur. So that's a limitation in Eevee, that it only does it with the camera. There is, however, an add-on. So if you search for like Eevee motion blur, there's an add-on. Which allows you to get more, actual object motion blur, not camera motion blur. So you can read about that there. But yeah, so those are limitations. If I now go into cycles and turn on motion blur here, that will work with object motion blur and camera motion blur without a problem. So if I just turn up just the shutter over here, because my computer is being slow because it doesn't like doing this. It's kind of hard to see because it's a little bit of a subtle effect in this case. If I increase the speed of the change over here, maybe you'll be able to see it a little bit better. Does it not actually render in the viewport the motion blur? That might be the case. Probably should tell you that if you press F12 you get the proper render, not the viewport render. Yeah, so I think it's the case that the motion blur in cycles only pops up in a render, a proper render, not a viewport render. Yeah, that is the case. So you can see the ball is blurring streaked across the screen over here because it's moving so fast with the settings that I've got. So this is like where you trade off things. In Eevee you can get instant results and see how things will look immediately. Cycles, you can see here that it is slowly rendering bit by bit bits of the frame, so but your things will be way more accurate and realistic looking. So you can see how slow this is being. And this little streak over here is that ball sliding across the screen. I'm cancelling by pressing the escape key because I don't need to finish rendering that. So what you were seeing was that little highlights of this sphere sliding across the screen. So I'm just going back to Eevee and I'm just going to move on to the next step. So that's motion blur in Eevee. And the next step is volumetrics. So if you were watching last week, I was trying to do clouds, and there's a limitation I didn't know about the volumetrics in Eevee, is that it will only work in the bounds of an object. So the bounds of an object, like a sphere, is not the actual shape of the object, it is the extents of the object. So the furthest to the left, the furthest to the right, the furthest to the top, those are the bounds. So if I go and add a, I'm just going to remove the surface shader on, oops, that's not what I wanted to do. I need to add a new shader on here. Okay. Just for this ball specifically, I'm just going to remove the surface of this, and I'm going to add a volume shader with a, so the surface is the surface of the object and the volume is the interior. So I'm just going to add a principled volume shader to the volume instead of the surface. And you'll see when I turn up the density, if you can see it over here, it basically turns into a cube, because it's working with the bounds of the object, not the actual shape of the object. So that's a limitation with volumes in Eevee. So it can work fine if you want to have a room filled with, you know, smoke or something. So if I turn this density to a nice little low value, let's go to 0.1 or something, you get some nice little soft volumetric stuff. You know, it looks like a little foggy room and stuff, so it works fine for that. You can also have shadows and stuff in there, but there are limitations, like the volumetrics itself won't cast shadows in the scene, whereas in Cycles you can actually have like clouds and stuff creating shadows. So this is the trade-off you get with Eevee for a you know, fast real-time renderer sort of thing. So as you see, this is supposed to be a sphere, but it's just doing a cube around it. But you can still get the cool effects of like around the light. You get this nice hazy sort of glow and stuff. If I now switch this same scene here into Cycles though, you'll see we get the actual shape of the sphere that we are wanting to use. But again, this is something like subsurface scattering, where it is slow, because it now, instead of just calculating from here to the surface of the object, it has to calculate steps in volume from here to there, and in some cases back, depending on the scattering and stuff. So you'll definitely get a lot noisier render, and you might have to use more samples if you're using volumetrics. So I'm just going to go and delete that for now. So there are a bunch of different settings for the volumetrics. Actually, let me just bring that back. So you can get volumetrics start and end. So start is how close to the camera the volumetrics starts. So if I adjust that, you see that the effects can come closer or only start further away from the camera. And end is basically the same, where they start and end. And you can add more detail by using adjusted settings, so you can have smaller rendered regions or larger rendered regions for the volumetrics, which basically just affects the detail and how fast it will calculate. And again, you've got samples. And there are different settings over here, so you can turn on volumetric shadows, which allows, if I grab this sculpture, just so we get it in the air there, you can see it trying to calculate shadows in this volume. Well, hopefully you can, if the stream is not encoding it too terribly. So you can see the nice little God ray effects and stuff there. Whereas if I turn off, you see how it basically just affects calculating shadows from the volume itself. Okay, that's what I said it wasn't doing. Can you just trust me? Was that No, it still calculates the shadows in there. Okay. Never mind. Let me try something. Honestly, I don't see a difference between it on or off. Might be something that I need to look at the documentation for why it is doing that like that. If we go now into cycles, you'll see the same stuff, but it'll be way more accurate, but noisy. See, as I move things around, it's way slower to see anything actually happening in there. And I hope this all comes through on the stream, because I know it will be affecting my encoding and stuff. So there aren't really that many more settings to look at for Eevee. We're not going to go into like the advanced stuff, I don't think, like freestyle, which is like for outline effects and stuff. There is an option to turn on high quality normals. Personally, I haven't actually noticed a difference using this. If you want to look at more detail of these things, if you go to the documentation on the Blender website, so under the Blender docs, you can find all these different settings if you actually want to go into a little bit more detail on what every single one of these toggles do. I'm just going for the big ones. Yeah, like Volumetrics can do some cool effects. You get that nice hazy sort of thing happening in here. It's a really nice thing to add to something. But you'll see that Eevee, because it's faking a lot of these things, it looks weird. Like you can see the light through the object, so it makes weird things happen over here. Maybe that is what this setting does. Nope, doesn't affect that. If I just switch now to cycles, you'll see you won't get the light shining through there. You'll get the actual effect of what it would look like. You're not getting the light appearing in the middle of fog that it's blocked by. And yeah, then you got the different settings for shadows. So you can, I did change this a little bit earlier, so you can use a larger cube for the shadows. So that's the cube map basically. If you have it a bigger number, you get more detail in the shadows. So you can actually see this in the volumetrics here when I do stuff. You get a little bit more resolution on the edges in the shadowed regions. Whereas if I put this down to like 128, it just loses a lot of detail. If I now aim this down, let's just aim this at the ground so you can see the edges over here. So you get a lot pixely looking shadows over here. Cascade is kind of difficult to explain, but basically what it is, it renders the shadows in different resolutions depending on the distance from the light. So I'm not going to really go into detail on that, but you can mess with these to get some variation of different lighting on here, but it's going to be quite subtle actually. And this is where you can turn on soft shadows So basically what that does is basically sort of renders the shadows multiple times just to blur them out a little bit. Cycles will actually do a proper calculation. So this, you'll see that soft shadows is just each shadow rendered however many samples you have. So if I just go down to one sample, you see it renders the shadow once. If I go to twice, 2 samples, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And then the more you have, the more blurred that soft shadow will be. So that's the main thing the samples will do for the quality in Eevee. Whereas in Cycles, samples will be basically every single pixel, how many times you look at like details and stuff, and my thing just goes crazy when I rotate it in Cycles. This is why I'm mainly looking at Eevee for my stream. Hopefully you can still hear me. So if I look at the shadows here, they're nice and soft and blurred in Cycles, without that sort of sharp edging between each of the samples and stuff, but you just get lots of noise. Indirect lighting. Now this is something where you're never going to get the same results in Eevee as you do Cycles, and it's something that I love, which is bounce lighting effects. So you can fake it in Eevee. You can use a thing called a irradiance volume. So if I add that in, I'm just going to delete this volume now because we don't need it. You'll see that if I scale this up, we get like an area with points in there. And this will like calculate from each of these points what indirect lighting you get. So like how much light is reaching bounced from areas around here. So if I bake indirect lighting now, it'll calculate all this bounce lighting and stuff, and you would think we might get some bounce lighting effects over here. Let me just double check this thing in our settings here. Just going to add a few more sample points in here for a little bit more detail. Move this a bit closer to the ground so we can see some. I just want to see if it is easy to see. So the more of those grid points you add, the slower this bake will be. So baking is just for calculating, basically. And there are a bunch of different settings you can add here to like number of bounces and stuff, and the detail and stuff. I'm not going to go into all of that. Honestly, I wonder if this only shows up in renders because I'm not seeing it. Let's check something. Okay, I used this before and it worked fine, or maybe it's just that the effect is pretty weak. Let me see. Oh, it's because of the glossiness. Let me just make this purely rough and see what this looks like. Because it does have clamps for But as you can see, this can be a little bit of a tedious thing to set up. Yeah, so it is that it only likes to work on purely rough objects, unless you mess around with the intensities and stuff over here. So we can get a little bit of bounced lighting effect by using that irradiance cache. So you can see a little bit more detail on the cape over here. A little bit more detail inside there around the hand and stuff. But honestly, if you want to use nice cool bounce lights and stuff, you want to go and use Cycles, because that's built in. That's just how it works. You'll see how much lighting you get just from things bouncing around in the scene, and it's always nice. If you like bounce lighting and things like that, LuxCore is where things get really cool. Because Cycles is awesome, but it doesn't do things like caustics. Caustics, if you imagine like looking at the bottom of a swimming pool and you get those cool, glossy, sort of shiny, swishy light effects at the bottom of the pool, that's caustic. So if you shine like a light through a glass and you get those cool shiny bits on the surface in the shadow, those caustics. You don't get those in Cycles. That's something like LuxCore. You can get that. The lighting is different because LuxCore is using its own sky lighting system for this. Yeah, those are the basic render settings for Eevee. There are other things, like something that you might want to look at is if you want to render a object like this sculpture and you want to render it like as a PNG with transparency, you want to go to Film and turn on Transparent, and you'll see that you get this sort of like if you're using Photoshop, the little transparency grid in the background. So basically that just when you render your image, you can save the transparency information for the non-object areas of the image, which is always useful for getting the alpha channel out. So I want to show you Cycles stuff, but it seems that whenever I do, my music starts cutting out and my stream sort of starts dying. So I think I'm going to show you some material stuff in that case. So we've like talked about glossy and stuff, but like how would you add other stuff to it? So let's go look at our sculpture over here and go into a little bit more detail on like the basic default Principled BSDF shader. Let me look that up again. I said it the other day, but I've now already forgotten. Bidirectional scattering distribution function. Beautiful. So I'm going to go through the basics of here. Base color is, we've covered that before, that's just simply the color of the object. Subsurface, we covered that a little bit earlier. We don't have that turned on anymore, so we're not actually getting that effect. So let's go back into here. Oh, he's on. I think it might just be because doesn't really like this color. Let's go turn saturation off. Interesting. Well, these settings over here are basically the subsurface radius. So you remember how I said by default is sort of set to a blood and sort of skin subsurface. So that's basically these values over here. So they're the red, green and blue settings for the subsurface radius. So if you look at this RGB, so red is set to 1, so there's going to be a lot more red scattering, and blue is very low, so you're not going to have much blue scattering. So a lot more red, a little bit of green, so you get from sort of white down to orange, and then red for the deep areas, which is basically what skin looks like. You can also fake those colors by changing the subsurface color to whatever you want. Metallic, so it doesn't like subsurface scattering on metallic surfaces, that's why. So metallic makes an object seem more metal, but what makes an object seem more metal? It's basically how the color changes between the surface and the reflection. So if you have a metallic object, the reflections will be the color of the surface, whereas if it's non-metallic, it'll be the color of what you're seeing reflected. So if I go and turn the roughness to 0, and let's actually do this in cycles. My computer will hate it, but I think it'll be easier to show you. So let's make the surface color for this. I'm just going to change the plane in the background to be a different material. Just so you can see an object of a different color over here. And now you can see that nice bounced lighting coming in over here. This is bouncing blue light from below. And let's make this, so the opposite of blue, let's make this red. So you see that this is now a 0 metallic surface with 0 roughness. So we're getting a lot of reflections of the blue object in it. But if I now make it more metallic, you see the blue has sort of been made sort of dirty and red because it's using the surface color to sort of affect that a little bit. So it's, and it also affects how like the gloss on the surface changes. So it's not going to be this sort of diffuse lighting, it's going to be just the glossy element on the surface. Otherwise it's all going to be just sort of this red but blended all together into one color. That makes any sense at all. And here's actually a good point to show you specular. Specular 0, if you look in the darker areas, see how the reflection, you get more of the reflected areas with that, the color of the glossy, the reflected area in there. I turn that down, that color disappears. And then you also get specular tint, and I'm actually not sure what specular tint does, because you don't get a color value to add to that. Does it use the color of the surface? I think it might do. Yeah, it tints the specular reflections by the color of the surface itself, I believe. And roughness is just how rough the surface is. So 0 roughness will be a perfect mirror. 1 roughness will be, as you can see here, sort of very rough, clayish, sort of non-shiny surface. Anisotrophic. So that's the surface blur of an object. So if I make this just semi-rough, just so we can see some glossy bits over here. So at the moment it's anisotropic 0. If I make that 1, you see how it stretches out these glossy regions across the surface. So if you imagine something like a polished aluminium thing where it was ground with little grooves on it, you'll get little grooves will reflect light in a specific direction. Or something like a CD, you know how the light sort of makes those little rays in certain directions? It's because little grooves in the surface reflect light into one specific direction. So that's the effect that you'll get from this. So I can actually probably just show you this in EV as well. We don't need the reflections anymore. Actually, it doesn't really work as nice. It doesn't like animals. Let's just go back to Sinus so we can see it better. So then you can also control the rotation of this. At the moment it's going down the chest over here. I'll just zoom in a little bit so you can see a bit better. And things will be covering. Let's just make it smooth. Come on, Blender. Okay, I just turned on shade smooth so we can get nice and smooth things there. You see, as I increase the anisotropy, it just stretches in one direction, and then you can rotate this to follow a certain direction. So now we've got it sort of going along the collarbone over here, and then just bending around in different areas like that. So you can get some specific effects. So if you wanted a CD, you might want to actually put a texture to actually follow in spokes around an object or something like that. So the next one is a very subtle effect. When you go into EV, I think this should make no difference now. I might actually have to Google this because let's go to rendering settings in the Blender manual. So, because this one I'm actually not certain myself. Here are specific choice cycles, choice settings. Where are specific materials? There's principal BSDF. That's what I thought, but I wasn't actually seeing any difference. So sheen is velvet-like reflection nearing edges or stuff like cloth. But honestly, I was looking at the edge of the shoulder here and I did not see any difference when I had turned it on and off. Okay, maybe a tiny little bit of a difference. Maybe if you've got a more wavy surface, let's look at the edge here of this cloak. I mean, there's a tiny difference, but it doesn't make a lot. As I said, it's a pretty subtle effect. The next one is where things get pretty interesting. So you get clear coat. So imagine like a car paint or something. Clear coat is like a surface on top of the surface. So this will now sort of be simulating having two surfaces on here. So you see when I turn that between 0 and 1. Oops, sorry, I didn't change the camera correctly. So clear code, if I turn that between 0 and 1, you get a little bit of a change in brightness. And you can actually have clear code roughness, so you can have specific reflections on the clear code surface that are glossier than you would have on a normal surface. So that can be quite cool. So IOR in the next setting is the way light reflects within an object. As far as I know, it won't make any difference to a solid object. That will only really have an effect when you've got a transparent object. Transmission is light passing through an object. So in this, as a solid one, there's no actual transparency in it, so it's just making it look sort of like glass, but there's no sort of reflection or stuff happening in there. If you want to have that, you would have to turn on screen space refraction in the settings of the material, and you would have to have your object be transparent. And I think you might actually have to have your UV settings to have screen space reflections on. I'm not certain. Yeah, you have to turn on refraction in there. Yeah, that doesn't even seem to be doing it. EV is still actually kind of new to me. I haven't been using much refraction in there, because usually if you want to be doing refraction and stuff, if I switch now to cycles, it's not going to look great either, because the Principled BSDF is not really designed for transparent things. If you really want that effect, you would want to use something like the Glass BSDF. You see if that turns on, we get the nice little refractions and stuff going on over here. So it's all about using the right material design for the specific situation that you're trying to do. So if I switch that now to EV, even with the glass material, it still just looks boring. So if things get cool again with emission, so this is where you can make glowing surfaces. So if I make this a blue emission, we get a glowing blue object. Again, this is something where you might want to use cycles if you want to actually have the object affect the world, because in cycles you can actually make it cast light, whereas in EV it doesn't cast light. So if I go into cycles, see, we're actually getting light glowing out of this. If you look at the base there, we've got some blue glow appearing on the ground, and it's actually glowing around itself and looking pretty cool. It's like inverse shadows, which is a pretty cool effect. So really, think for EV if you want to do simple, maybe cartoonish animations, you know, with just smooth surfaces and stuff like that. Cycles if you want to do cool lighting effects with transparency, reflections, refractions, and bounced lighting and stuff like that. So that's the basics of the main Principled BSDF. That's under the surface shader, but you also get the volume shader, which I sort of briefly showed you, and then if you go into cycles you actually get another option for displacement. Jiffy. What? I'm confused. What do you mean a Jiffy? Like a moment? Is someone asking me for a Jiffy? So if you see, if I switch now into .jiffy form, oh, that's weird. No, I don't know. I've not heard of that. So if I switch into cycles, you see that under volume we've got a displacement setting. So you can use that for pushing the surface around. But that's going to start going into more advanced stuff. I'm actually googling .jiffy. No idea. Doesn't even come up as a quick. So it's a JPEG stored in a different way, but okay. Apparently. Honestly, I never heard of it in working graphics, so. Yeah. So if you want to do stuff with the displacement and the volume stuff, you can get stuff like the cloud effects that I've got in this render. So you can get the cool sort of pushed out cloud surface, waves, and then the volumetric effects to get the clouds.
Wow!
Doing stuff. And this is why I did this in cycles, because you can get the cool stuff with the light reflections over here. Like if you're looking on the way the light's bouncing around on the rocks, the underside will just get these little bit of glows and stuff. Whereas if you're doing this in Eevee, you'll just get flat. Love that slapper. So this scene, there's still lots I want to do on it, but I think it was getting beyond the basics with Blender stuff, and I want to go and do some stuff that you guys can do more. So I'm going to work on this in my own time, turn it into a final scene. Because it was also starting to slow down my computer horribly. As you can see, just moving around it can be a bit annoying. So I did some stuff to detail the cliffs in here, get that more sedimentary layers and stuff. Yeah, I actually don't know what else to cover with you guys today, because I was really hoping to get the scene rendered out and, you know, go through it more, but it kind of sucks. My computer was just being so slow. And I kind of covered all the basic settings for rendering in Blender, but I would really like to know what you would want to do next week. So I had the suggestion from what was her name? I'm sorry, Zan, for retopology, but I'd like some others as well. Retopology is a cool thing, but I think that goes beyond basics, because then you would already have a mesh to work on. Quick mesh design. I can do a quick mesh design. But what? Because I did have the rover that I was going to work on. The rover with the penguins. Let me just search. I did have a rendered version here somewhere. Penguin doing what? Goose in a suit. Yeah, let's do the goose in the suit. Why not? So I think this is where we'll say the basics with Blender segment ends, and now we're gonna do a goose in a suit. And I'll probably put a poll on my Patreon page once I have had some suggestions. I've only had one so far. You can also message me on here or on my Instagram or Twitter. You can always message me at PhotonWindow on pretty much all these things. So, yeah, thanks for joining in. Hopefully you learned some stuff about rendering and enjoyed my little silly goose, and see you next week for some proper basics with Blender. Cheers.